So we're on to our second panel today, and so we have our moderator, Edith Luhanga. She's an assistant research professor at Carnegie Mellon University, Africa. We have Joseph Abakunda from the Chief Strategy Officer at Rwanda Space Agency. We have Richard Ferguson, Vice Chancellor, Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture, RICA. And we have Vineet Singh, a Senior Platform Architect of Digital Green. Please come forward.
So welcome to the second panel for the agriculture session. We've had a lot of great discussions so far about agriculture and data and everything around that, but I'll start with a disclaimer before I invite the panelists to introduce themselves. I'm a technologist who's been on farms. I'm by no means an agricultural expert, so please bear with me with some of the, I will ask for a lot of explanations during this panel. So I would like to start with you, Joseph. Can you please tell us more about yourself and we've heard some of the strategies that are being put in place at RSA, but could you tell us a bit more about some of the future work that you're also looking at?
Thanks, Edith. I think speaking after Dr. Yves really makes it very easy because he's just summarized the work that we do. Maybe one piece that I would add to that is the goal here is really the policymaker and to make evidence-based insights, but at the same time, it's also really to add value to the impact, to the farmer themselves who are relying on us and do not have access, whether it's the amount of infrastructure, so I guess looking at it from the two aspects, whether it's from the policymaker or the farmer themselves, that gives you an idea of, I guess, what we're looking at in the future.
Thank you. So next to you, Richard, I welcome you to introduce yourself and also some of the work that you're doing at the Rwanda University of Conservation Agriculture.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Edith. My role is administrator now. I'm the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Research and Extension at RICA. RICA is a new institution in Rwanda. We're about 4 years old, focused on experiential education in agriculture with a goal to produce graduates who can be entrepreneurs and innovators in agriculture, primarily for Rwanda and East Africa. But before coming to RICA, I was a researcher and teacher and extensionist in the U.S. at the University of Nebraska with a focus on digital agriculture. And so much of what's been shared today has been fascinating to me to learn more about what's going on in Rwanda even, and East Africa and Africa in general in the area of digital ag.
Thank you. But before I move on, this is where I start to show my newness to the agricultural field. So what exactly is conservation agriculture?
That could have a long answer. There is a very specific definition that the FAO has within the UN that's very focused on soils. And as a soil scientist, I fully agree with that definition. It talks about limiting tillage, rotating crops, using permanent cover crops or residue. But at RICA, we more broadly define conservation agriculture. It is very much focused on either maintaining or building soil quality. We feel like the key to more productive, profitable agriculture in Rwanda starts with soil and being a good steward of the soil that we have. But there are other key components to conservation agriculture as RICA defines it, related to judicious use of inputs like fertilizer, seed, irrigation, pesticides, promoting biodiversity in the landscape, using spatially appropriate cropping and livestock systems, things that make sense in terms of maintaining the landscape and increasing productivity and profitability. We hope makes sense.
Thank you so much. Vineet, welcome back onto the podium here. You gave us an interesting keynote talk today, but could you please introduce yourself again and, just a brief introduction.
Sure. I'm working Yeah, I've been involved in helping build FarmStack at Digital Green for last 3 years. Now also taking care of what we are calling as direct to farmer organization product. Uh, I'm not an agriculture expert at all. I I am an aerospace engineer by education. Uh, and before this, I have worked on multiple things uh, in health tech. We were trying to create, automate a microscope so that remote diagnostics could be there. I worked in supply chain, and before that, I was basically making drones for living. So yeah, that has been my background. I'm more interested on how technology can be used to basically connect all these different information, or that's what fascinates me about FarmStack. There are all these different things, solutions that exist, but they don't reach to the farmers. And that has been my, my goal for last 3 years.
Thank you so much. So the title of this panel is all about resilient agriculture and using data-driven practices to achieve this. But one of the challenges I face is it seems like every single article or, I don't know, blog I read, it seems to have some kind of a different definition for a lot of these terms. So what does resilient agriculture look like exactly for somebody like me who's a layman? What does that look like, and what sort of data do we really need to achieve it? So maybe I'll start with you, Vineet.
I think, so what I have been discussing with a lot of agriculture experts, and I think Richard would be better person to answer. But there are two parts to it. One is resilience against, especially the climate change that is happening very often. The farmers need to adopt certain practice which will make them resilient towards the climate changes and the variabilities or uncertainties that are there. The second aspect is also about what kind of practices that lead to lesser climate damage that's happening, right? And I think more than data, I think for the resilient, for having that driving those adoption, it needs tangible benefits to the farmers. And when we talk about tangible benefits, we need to, either farmer wants to reduce the immediate cost or increase the price or mitigate the risk. They are not able to understand, how the risk is mitigated. So I think the main focus for, as per my, understanding from a very periphery, not being the core expert, is that farmers need tangible benefit, and for that we need to rather create some sort of a information that is already there, about what they are doing and how they will actually be able to benefit. That needs to be explained to drive the adoption of such resilient practices. Everyone knows what are those practices, but it requires a level of effort. I think, Richard, you would have a much richer view on that.
I think you've done a great job. I fully agree with things that you've shared and said. I might add, resilience to me indicates tolerance to stress. And the stress can come from a variety of sources. The one that's probably highest in many people's mind is weather or longer-term climate stress. So a cropping system or a livestock system that's resilient against stress is going to be one that can maintain productivity throughout levels of stress, whether it be weather or insect or fertility. So a system that's resilient is going to maintain productivity over time, and that's a challenge. Sometimes, often in agriculture, we're limited because growing seasons only come around so often. We can't replicate them in the lab every week or every month. In parts of the world, you get one growing season a year. In Rwanda, we're blessed to have more than that. But to really understand if a system is resilient against stresses, one needs time to evaluate that. So generally would take several years to truly document whether one system is more resilient than another over a period of weather that occurs over those years. And then you can document the changes that have occurred in profitability and productivity and be able to measure resilience.
Thank you. Over to you, Joyce.
Honestly, they've covered the biggest part of it. I guess the only aspect I would add is the mere fact that we deal with policymakers a lot. Resilience for me would also be policymakers making, I guess, data-driven decisions. And that's the platform that my colleague shared. I guess what drove us developing the GeoHub and the crop health monitoring, the field boundary segmentation that is a part of that. But I feel like you also want to avoid a scenario where all the agriculture at the farm level, a very resilient agriculture system is built, but then the people making the decisions, it's very difficult for them to derive data-driven insights out of that. So I think the two go hand in hand, and I think that's, I guess, comes full circle as far as resilience is concerned.
Thank you. Now, I'm glad I asked that question because every time I look at the definitions of resilient agriculture, we focus so much on things like climate change, but I hardly ever see the human aspect captured into it. And so I'm really glad I asked that question because this is coming up again. The data we're collecting, the focus of resilience, it has to also focus on how it benefits the people at the end. It's not just about what data we can collect and how much of it we can collect. But so we know that we need data that will be useful to the people, but how do you get to that point where you're able to really collect data that is both useful for the people, but it's also allowing you to have the prediction level that you need years on end? How do we get to that level? And especially, how do we bring in people to be proactive in offering us some of this data that we need? So yeah, we can start with you, Joseph.
Oh, sorry, I forgot the mic was still on.
Sorry?
I forgot the mic was still on.
Oh, yeah.
Again, I think there's a role of government here because sometimes policy does drive innovation. And so when you are asking your question, if I was an engineer, the engineer in me wanted to approach that by building an AI model, right? That can go back in time and kind of see, what has this particular cash crop, for example, been acting within this particular season. But then by the time you finished your question, I actually see there's a role of government here from a regulatory perspective, kind of, preparing the field, no pun intended, but kind of setting the environment for all these players to kind of come and, innovate. So I think to answer your question, I think I would approach it by some sort of public and, research partnership of sorts.
Okay. So maybe I'll jump over to Vneet because you were talking to us about the example where you had to go physical because people had some form of distrust. So if we were to bring in government entities, how do we then create that trust that we need to help people get that? I know physical is one model, but then how do you come up with these community members? How do we just create that trust?
Yeah, I think when we are trying to create the products, there's a sort of a principle that leverage the existing behaviors. And I think the existing behavior is that the farmers trust their community members, the local community members. And I think there's some sort of a governance there itself. There's a lot of push from various governments, specifically in India, there is a big push towards creating local farmer-producer organizations or cooperatives. This could be more than any 300 or more farmers who can, and they all need to be farmers, and they will be the kind of shareholders of that cooperative, and they will run and govern that. Now, the problem with any data collection that even we have tried with government partners and also else is it is very top down. We are asking hundreds of questions and hundreds of different data points. It's like someone coming and asking me what kind of disinfectant I'm using in my home or what kind of a detergent I'm using. How will I remember that? So a lot of this data that ends up is questionable to be used later on. On the other hand, if the local community, if you involve the community members, what happens is, and let them create some sort of a governance mechanism, what happens is that they have that trust, and they have that, they can inform of the reward that will be there if the correct information is given. And the information has to be collected at that particular time. Like, you know, how much fertilizer I applied or how much manure I applied. Like, one farmer will say, I applied 3 buckets. Now, what does that bucket mean? And we are talking about smallholder farmer with 1 acre, 2 acre, half acre kind of thing. So I think that timeliness, the trust, that is something that comes with local community, and where we can support is through the monetary incentives that can be given to these local communities themselves, because basically this data collection person needs to get some level of incentive for doing that particular job. And I think the other part is also on creating those interfaces which are very important. Today, if I look at the data collection tool, we are basically transferring what we find at the back end. We have a habit of looking at a table, a nicely put table. This is not a user-friendly way of inputting data. This is a user-friendly way of analyzing data for a data analytics or data. But for the end user, the most intuitive way is when you are messaging on, you know, WhatsApp or Telegram and all these applications. So those are the kind of, you know, I think we need to leverage a lot of these existing behaviors that are there, prevalent, and a lot of these existing platforms that are already also there, which can enable, I think a very recent example through a visit, I can cite it. There's a local, they call it KVK, Krishi Vigyan, because basically a local body, government body, which is about, and there's a plant protection scientist. He's part of 45 WhatsApp groups. And in the peak time, he is getting close to 10, 20 messages on each of these WhatsApp group about some plant disease, the stress kind of thing. And a lot of time, and that is where he's getting all these pictures. He's able to identify the diseases 80% of the time, 20% of the time he'll not. And this is happening. And this is an example of human plus the existing network that is already there, which is getting formed. And this is, and these groups are basically moderated by the local community members. And this is something that has happened on its own. So yeah, I think the answer lies somewhere when we look at the existing structure and how we can formalize those kind of structures better. That would be my take.
That's an interesting anecdote. So we do have even smallholder farmers at some level being, I guess, data scientists, because 45 WhatsApp groups, that's a lot of messages to go through and analyze and make decisions based on that. Richard, what would be your perspectives on how we add this value to humans via data?
Well, I was fascinated to learn more about the activities of the Rwanda Space Agency today, something I should have known more about. To me, that's the type of role that government provides well, should provide well. Doing data management, data collection, data provision that cannot be done at the local level or farmer level or even probably by private industry. So things like imagery and field boundaries, localized, more accurate weather data, either temporally or spatially accurate. Those kinds of resources, to me, are something that are best provided as a base by governments, by countries, from which then private entrepreneurs can build on that to add value. Most smallholder farmers in Rwanda are not going to maintain a spatial database, but someone providing that service to a cooperative as a consultant could do that, building on what government resources are already available and then adding localized value, very much along the line of what Vinique has already described. To me, that seems like a good way to bring very high capacity information to smallholder operations in Rwanda.
Yeah, and that's a good opportunity for digital public goods to formalize some of these informal data that is appearing, but also to provide the long-term sustainability of some of these infrastructures, to build them and keep them sustainable over time. So I know there's quite a few people I've met in the audience who are in the agricultural sector or would like maybe to contribute. Any questions or comments so far from the audience? Do we have? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Racine from Academia 2063. I just want to come back to the definition of resiliency to all the panelists. Do you think that providing data and analytics before a crisis is part of resiliency rather than afterwards to measure how long did you stay on the crisis stage? I don't know if it's clear enough. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
I'll take the first shot. Well, data is always informative, always useful. So if you have data before a crisis, that is great. Sometimes we don't know what the crisis is going to be, so we haven't collected the kind of data that helps us inform about that crisis. So there's a happy medium in there somewhere. One can collect all the possible data that you can, but you can't really afford to do that or archive it or manage it. So you have to make some effort at anticipating what the relevant data might be and try and have that available ahead of a crisis event to be able to document interventions and change during and after the crisis.
Yeah, I agree with Richard. Within the agency, while building the National GeoHub, we did come up with this during one of our brainstorms, data resiliency. And the way we interpreted it was, to an agricultural person, it might not make sense before there's a crisis. But we try to, and I guess it's one of the challenges we face when dealing with data is the worst data is not the least amount of data. It's not data. It's really data that is siloed, and so kind of having this data tell you a story. So instead of just seeing, let's say, the amount of precipitation as relevant, let's say, to the Rwanda Water Board, you're now looking at it, in concert with the human activity of that area. What's the government's plans, for growth in that area? Is this a border town? What's the amount of trade that's going on? And all these socioeconomic indicators kind of come give you a much bigger story. So I agree with Richard. I think any data is usually good. And even if there's no crisis in agriculture, it's probably going to tell you a story in another area that might actually, affect agriculture down the road.
Would you like to add to that?
No, I think I very much agree, and yeah, I think the problem that we have seen in some of the things that we have tried out, it's always very fascinating to talk about preemptive thing, but I'll give a example of, the planting date to be told to farmer based on when it is likely to rain. And everyone knows that the prediction of the rain forecast is beyond 5 days is pretty bad. And if I'm giving it 2 weeks before, basically I'm tossing a coin. It could go anywhere. And what happens is, when we are telling that to the farmer is basically saying, yeah, it's raining already. So we had a locust attack which was across different continents, and I don't think a lot we were able to do a lot in terms of taking preemptive actions there. And I don't think one part is creating those models first, but the other part is also that there are existing models about various kind of things. How to make it reach to the farmers, and specifically look at those kind of models or those kind of things which are possible to be done, based on climate, like beyond 4 weeks. I don't think that could lead to, but there are certain disease forecasts and stuff like that which can very well be modeled, and for those specific places there could be a preemptive action that can be taken.
All right, any more questions from the audience? So you all three raised good points, and it's got me to thinking about climate change in itself and how it affects the data. So I'm from Tanzania, and where my grandmother is from, they've had, I think the last 5 years, she's been describing it to me as atypical years. It's years where the rainfall hasn't been consistent, crops haven't been consistent. So if we're really thinking about all this data-driven agriculture, how do we handle these sort of atypical years that just mess up the data? How do we keep the value when the data we're getting is not the right kind of data? I welcome anyone to take the first shot at this.
That's the best kind of data, in my opinion. It informs you about some of the extremes, helps you anticipate what may be coming. Unless somehow there's an error in data collection, I wouldn't say it's bad data. It's just falling outside of what you expected. So it's giving you some idea of trends. Climate information is really hard to discern trends even within decades. So it's really helpful if you have climate data, weather data that goes back many decades. In many cases, unfortunately, that's not available, but sometimes it's helpful, I think, to look at trends that you're seeing here and compare that to trends that are being seen elsewhere and where they have longer-term data. That may give you some insight. Is that really just an extreme for this year, or is it a trend that we need to be aware of and follow?
I agree with Richard again on this. Because we don't have enough data going back to 30 years, what we try to do, if you may think of it as hacking the system, is we try to get in touch with other people with a very similar, whether they're in the tropics, whether they are on the African continent, south of the equator, all these different profiles. And we try to talk to them very specific to crops. So like right now, one of the, problems that we're dealing with or that we're working on is one in regards to coffee rust. And this is something that in the 90s was, think of it like the coffee pandemic or within South America. The current models we have tell us, with the tropical winds coming in about 2025, plus or minus, we better be ready. And we've already, mapped out a few plantations within, the southern part of Rwanda where this has been detected, and we've mapped it out. And the reason, again, why I was coming back to the data silo issue is we actually do have air quality happening. We also have Climate Observatory, which kind of monitors greenhouse gas emissions. And we're trying to put all these under one roof, specifically for issues like coffee rust. And so far, we've managed to at least, look at the wind pattern. And again, the winds come from Tanzania, they come all the way to Rwanda, going into the Congo. And that at least gives you an idea of, I've actually forgot to say coffee rust, for those that don't know, is actually airborne transmitted, which, just changes the level of urgency if you're talking about a 2-3 year timeline. So now you actually want to have accurate wind models. And so, yeah, I agree with Richard's point that this is the best kind of data, but then sometimes your best answers are going to be from places like, in our case, with coffee rust in South America, which happened over 20 years ago.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think totally, completely in line with what my colleagues and panelists said. And I think when it comes to quality of data itself, irrespective of climate or any other angle that we are looking at, my experience is that the transaction data, look at the transaction data, and transaction data, that doesn't mean financial transactions. It is any kind of exchange that might be taking place, is that is going to be accurate if we can capture those particular points, because that definitely, and that can act as a proxy for certain other parts, like the amount of seed I have bought. I'm assuming that the farmer is going to apply that seed, or so those kind of information can be used to corroborate what is being observed on ground, or to validate further things. So I think the key lies in the transactional information at various places. If I go and ask someone, if someone asks me a lot of information about how I'm doing what I'm doing, I'll just give some information. It might not be correct. So that lies at the core of it. And I think the other is giving some sort of a reward mechanism for, so that there is a reward for incentive for entering correct data rather than, or telling correct thing rather than wrong thing. Right now, I think a lot of incentive is there for entering wrong information especially in when we are dealing with the smallholder farmers in various geographies in India. There's incentive for, there's no incentive for entering correct information. Let me put it that way. So that I think has to also be corrected.
So what I'm hearing is that data is useful even when it is not what you expect, and also when it's coming from other countries as well. We've heard a lot about health data sharing earlier today during the healthcare session. What is the status of agricultural data sharing? Are there any concerns people have, and how do we overcome some of these concerns?
Yes, I think there can be. Thinking of satellite or remote sensing imagery, if one uses that to infer yield or production, and you have enough resolution to be able to zoom into a field level, then you know something about that farmer. And that farmer might consider his production to be proprietary information. So I know in the US and Europe, the level of aggregation of geospatial data has been a subject of much discussion. At some level, highly precise and accurate information is really helpful. If you can get to sub-meter level imagery, that really helps you manage better, but it also exposes your information that you consider yours as a farmer to everybody else. So that's, I don't know that I have a good answer for that, but that is a concern.
It's interesting that yield can be viewed as personal data. I never thought of that. Would anybody else, Vineet, Joseph, and would you like to add to that? We'll start with Vineet.
Yeah, I think, so one of the use case that I presented in the slide, there was a block saying that the farmers giving their consent, because farmers are, even the smallholder farmers, are wary of telling what is the actual yield, because that's the financial information. In fact, and that's where the local community and trust and all those things come into picture. I think if you go back, this is a kind of, not giving that correct information is deep rooted, because they were taxed for whatever was produced. So why will I? And there are a lot of other subsidies and other government incentives that are there, which requires, they are very complex in nature. So they don't want to miss those certain subsidies as well. So a lot of this information needs consent from the farmers, and they want to give, but they want to understand for what purpose we are giving. So there has to be a technology which will ensure that if I'm giving this data for this purpose, it's used for this purpose only. Right now, if I'm I'm sharing this crop picture that I have this disease, if this information is used in a different way, apart from telling me that this is what you need to apply to safeguard your crop, then I'm doomed. But right now, farmers are not concerned about sharing this information, because they want this solution as soon as possible. So I think, yeah, those are the kind of concerns that farmers have, at least.
Thank you. So to wrap up, because we're at the end of time, Joseph, what would be your perspectives on how we can overcome some of these data sharing challenges?
I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think data literacy would go a long way. I think all these discussions are being had at the level of assumption, where we think everyone understands or wants, this kind of data in this. So I guess I'll double down on data literacy.
Thank you so much. So we are at the end of our time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their insights today. Thank you very much.